All right, so the first thing you're probably going to do is just essentially lay this thing out linearly in Logic. So just do it as though you could control the timing and the order and everything. Okay, so that's the first thing I did, is I just did this thing. Here's my whole book. Has a pre-built sequence. Alright, it's supposed to be here. Okay? So that would be step one, is just lay it out. But when you're doing it, start thinking about, as you're doing it, how you might start splitting everything up. For example, if you look at what I'm doing here with the music, I've got it in chunks already. So, I'm using this little loop here, and that'll cover that first page or two, potentially. And then I'm flipping over to a new thing over here. So I start all new loops there. If I can start it as a new loop in Logic, I can start it as a new loop in... Same thing there, I just flipped over to something new. And here again I flipped over to something new. And if you notice the way I have this right now, this little drum thing is going through the whole thing, but this stuff is changing. Okay? So in reality, this I could decide how I want to do this. If I could start by just saying, well, that loop that'll span 3 or 4 pages. But what I'm doing when I flip pages is I'm jumping between these loops. Okay, and then the worst case scenario is if they jump to the middle of the page, they get the marimba, but they don't have the drum. And I could either be okay with that, or I could say if I don't want that, then I just have to restart. I have to stop and restart that drum loop. If I wanted to, if it was important to me that I had that there. But it's easy because I know I'm going to start that loop at the beginning, right? So if I'm going to start the marimba loop there, I could just as easily restart the drum loop as well if I needed to. All right, so I've designed this to be something that can be split up into little chunks and still make sense. And as you can see, the only one that really is a problem is this Jeep sound. So this has to go for a couple of pages before I ultimately stop it, and now we're not in the Jeep anymore. And I couldn't quite figure out a way around that one.
Can you program steps?
Sure, I could. I mean, I could stop the Jeep and start it back up again if I wanted to, but I don't think I did in this case.
For whatever page hits between right before 17,
Mm-hmm.
where the Jeep ends.
Yeah.
Could you Can you? I don't understand how we're programming this thing in the sampler and like how it's like how we're getting it to play what devices, what audio files.
Right.
And like, so I don't know. Like, can you tell it?
Yeah.
Stop and use as much as start.
Yeah. So that's what I'm showing you today. So yeah, for example, this is how I get rid of my Jeep. Watch. I have that little screech. I go into a different drum loop. I have the little buffalo, and then I go into something else.
It stops because you ended the audio file, not
Right.
because you told it to stop.
Right. So now I have to figure. Now I've got this thing all laid out. Somebody opened the door. I think I saw Jim. Oh no, he's there. Okay. Now that I got this laid out, I have to figure out how am I going to put this into the sampler. Okay. So I got to start basically building these loops. So the first thing we hear is the Jeep. So I'm going to go ahead and just solo this. And then set it up here where I can at least get a loop point that I think will work. Okay, I only need to bounce enough that I can make a loop. Because the thing about samplers is that the length of your file, the entire length of that, has to get loaded into RAM in order for the sampler to work. So there's no point bouncing out a really long file that's just a loop. Just bounce it up to the end of the loop and then insert loop points so that it doesn't have to load that whole thing into RAM, but can just loop the small chunk of it. Okay, so I've got that, and let me just check and make sure that does what it's supposed to do. Seems to. So I go ahead and say, all right, I'm going to bounce that out. I bounce it. And then the next thing we hear is the music. So now I'll say, all right, that starts here. Let me solo this. Yep. And I'll go ahead and put this in with it so that those are mixed together. I won't do those as separate things. Again, I just need to take this as far as that loop. And then I'll set up a loop point in Triumph that jumps back to the part where the bass is.
You have to make sure that your loop points for both audio files on at the same time, because otherwise it'll stop one in the middle.
Yeah, so I did it to make sure that that happened. So you notice that the loop point for the drum lines up with the start point of the bass. So that was absolutely deliberate, so that I know I can set up a loop that'll work here. Right. So then I bounce that. Then the next thing I would hear was my Jeep horn. Should be this guy. So I'll go ahead and bounce that out as one thing. What?
When we get it going, because that horn only happened once in your book, right? If we stayed on that page, that horn would just happen.
Yeah, it'll happen every time I push the button.
But the other files play continuously and stay on the page. So there's a way to tell it to keep playing some audio file.
Yeah, it's loop versus don't loop. Right? So, yeah, because if I go over here to button 3, or no, see button 2. There it is. So I just get the horn by itself, and I can do that as many times as I want. So it doesn't loop. Neither does this. So what I did there is I actually bounced the zebra and the cow as one sample, because I had to get this into 15 buttons. It's like, well, I don't really want to do those two things happen on the same page.
Can you only program one audio? You said you bounced, what is it, the zebra and the cow together?
Yeah, so I bounced them as one. I believe I bounced them as one file.
Could you not have one button play two?
Sure, you could. Yeah, absolutely. But the problem there is if I have it be separate, then I have to, and if I want them to happen in, the zebra to happen first and then the cow to happen second, then I have to either, Well, the only way to do that without having them happen at the same time, because I can send a note on message for both things to the sampler, and it'll just start both of them at the same time.
You can't do it timing.
No, samplers don't do timings,
Okay.
right? So I would have to either bounce them as one file like this with that timing intact, or I would have to bounce the cow with a bunch of silence at the beginning of it.
Right.
So that when I start them both at the same time, I hear one, then the other. Okay. So let's see what our next thing is here. So you know, there's my little crash with the rhinoceros. So that one I'll probably do that one by itself, you know, or sum together. Right, this one. That's the crash.
What are you doing with audio 80?
That's the crash. This is the rhino. The audio, the wave just isn't rendering for some reason. I don't know why that's not rendering, but we can hear it, so. Just have a little bit of room there. Right, so I'd bounce that down as one thing. Okay, and then
Your output is flipping. Is that relevant, or does that matter?
let's see. Yeah, that's probably because one of these things is just boosted really high, it looks like.
So you would make sure to not bounce it while it's flipping?
Ideally, yeah. But, you know, that you could cheat and put a limiter in on the master, and then it would keep that from happening. All right, so then, you know, the next thing is the music changes at that point, right? So now I go into a different loop. Right, so I would start that up, and if I wanted to keep those separate, I could, but ultimately these are just going to loop. It's a straight up loop. So I'll bounce that as one thing. And then I've got the peel out, which is where the... So you can hear that. So what I'll do here is I want that to be separate because I may need to mix the level of that relative to the music. So I want it to be a separate file, but I'm going to go ahead and bounce it with the same timing as that loop so that it has that gap of silence at the beginning. That way, when I hit the one button, it starts these two things and this, but this will have a gap.
So you just want to adjust the yellow one?
Yeah. I'll just bounce it twice. So I'll bounce it this time without the peel out, and then I'll just invert that selection, bounce it again with that same amount of timing, and then I can have, right? So we sort of repeat that whole process. Now let's take a look at now what I've done. So if we go in to all of my samples, oh, here we go. So here's everything. So my first one is my opening music. And then I can set up a loop point in there, and it probably is. Let's see if I can load this up in Triumph, and it'll show it to me. Actually, I suppose I could do it here. So open in sample editor. So there's my loop in the yellow. Okay, so I start, the first little bit is just the, you can see it here. No, there. All right, it starts here, and then the bass sort of begins. So I'm looping it back to where the bass began. So the sample part, but what the sampler will do is it will start it from the beginning, play it to the end, and then it will loop back to the starting a loop point, which is there. Right. Okay. So let me see if it'll pull up in Triumph that way. Maybe.
We're using
Well, you may need that to set your loop points. No, you can't. You can do it in the Logic sample editor, but it just the visual feedback you get is not very helpful.
Why did you say dropping markers wouldn't work?
Because you need special loop markers, and it has to be sample loop markers, not Logic arrange markers. So that it's a specific kind of metadata that Logic does not bounce. Okay, like it'll bounce tempo markers, for example. But that's not what you need. Why that's not loading? Let's try another one here. That's there. New workspace. Well, all right, I'll have to figure that out later. Okay, so what else do I have here? If we look at our next thing is the Jeep start, so that's a separate thing, which is right here. Right, so that's its own little thing. Yeah, just the same way you did when you did your instrument, right? You're going to take it. These are just, there's no difference between these and your instrument recordings. They're just audio files. You just load them in. The only difference here is I'm just doing one per note, okay? And I've unchecked the pitch because I don't want it to mess with pitch, okay? Now here on the Jeep start, I also have a loop. So if we open that, you'll see. You know, I start at the beginning, but then when I get to the end here, I'm looping. Right, that yellow part is my loop, where it's going to loop back and forth with that last little bit of revving. Okay, so it'll start at the beginning and it'll just do that forever. And I can show you that just by hitting this. Maybe, let's see. I may have to do it over here. Oh no, I've killed it. It's probably because I opened Triumph. Oh no, it's because I've okay, that's why. Okay, so let me open this back up then. Okay, so as I hold this down, I'll hear it loop. Right, it's just going to go on forever. Yeah. Until I issue a note off of it. Yeah. So now it'll cut off. Okay. And then the next thing I have is my horn, and that's again one thing. So let me show the loop here. So some of these have loops turned on and some don't. Okay. So the opening music and the Jeep both have loop points defined, and I've got the loop turned on, but the horn doesn't. So the horn, right, it'll play as long as I hold it down until it gets to the end, and then once it gets to the end, it doesn't start over again, even if I'm still holding it down, because I've told it not to loop. Okay, and it looks like I did actually do the zebra and wildebeest together. So if I hit that, No, that's the rhino bump. This one. Right? So that's all one sample, not looped. Okay? And then the rhino bump is this one. That's one file, not looped. And then music 2. So notice how there's a gap on that one. I put a gap in it on purpose. So when I went to bounce this next little bit down, I decided I would bounce it based on the start of the impact. Because this was a weird loop, and rhythmically it was going to make it difficult because I've got this rhythm going underneath of it, and I couldn't guarantee that I could make that line up rhythmically. So what I decided to do instead was to go ahead and unloop that for a second, bounce this music down with that introduction, and then I can do a release time, essentially a fade out on this music that's looping when I've loaded into the sampler. And that fade out will be masked by this rhino crash bump thing. And then the new music will begin when that's done. So let me walk you through how that happened. So there's that, and then the gap there. So if you notice, let's see if let me show the loop and also the group. So notice I have the opening music assigned to group 2 in the sampler. Okay. And let's look at what group 2 does. So here's group number 2. And for the envelope 2, the amplitude envelope, these are offsets. So this is offset from whatever's out here. I've added a release of 1,556 milliseconds. So that means any zone in the sampler that I assign to this group will get a fade out that's a second and a half long when you do a note off on it. Okay, so I've assigned that music, that opening music, to that group so that it'll get a fade out when I release it. And I'll show you when I do it. See how it fades out? Right? And so that's how I'm able to make that transition work. So when I start this here, it sounds seamless. Okay, because if I go straight to that one, there's a gap there. There's a music gap that we wouldn't hear otherwise. But trying to think about the kid who jumps straight to that page with button 4 and just hits button 4, I want to make sure that something happens that makes sense. So I designed it and programmed it in a way to make that possible. So that if they're doing it in order, and this music is already playing, then they hit that button, that music starts to fade out as the crash happens, and then the new music picks up automatically. See, now that you've heard it, you'll hear it every time. You never heard it before until I explained what was going on. And now every time you'll hear that little fade out before that music comes in. But if you don't know that that's what's happening, you just get distracted by the crash and don't notice that there's something wonky going on with the music at that moment. Okay? So I was just able to design it in a way that could accomplish both scenarios, doing it from beginning all the way through and jumping straight there. So let's see. Then the peel out is this one, I think. Notice the gap on there? It's quite a big gap. I push the note, and then I hear it. And that's so that, again, I'm trying to make this work. So when I push this button, so So this is how I'm able to collapse things down into 15 buttons or less. Is I try to figure out when I push this button, how do I make it so everything happens that I want to have happen? And I want to make sure that that makes sense, whether I jump straight to that page or whether I start from the beginning. Okay, so when I bounced that peel out, I bounced it with some gap as well. All right, so then what's the next thing here? Ah, yes, my screech. So there's my screech. So everything that happens here, let's go back and look in Logic, in the arrange window, what has to happen there. I don't want to lose that. So here it is. So that's a page right there. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to align this up so that just to that little loop and bounce that music as a separate thing. Then I'll solo the town car, the Lincoln town car screech. And it's not a Jeep, it just was a good sounding screech. I liked it. So I'll bounce that down separately, and then I think I did the buffalo separate too, but I think the buffalo ended up with a gap. Yeah. So the buffalo has a little gap on it. So when I hit it all by itself, nothing happens for a second. But when I do it all together, I'm starting the screech and the music and the buffalo all at the same time. Right? And then this little thing will loop. I can stay on this page and just listen to this thing go back and forth all day long. Okay, so then the next thing is music 4, which is this guy. So that's, again, going straight to this. And this is where I kind of cheated a little bit, because I think that music is rather long. Yeah. Yeah. So this actually is going to cover like 2 pages. So if they happen to jump to page 2 of this, they wouldn't be getting this particular loop. But they would get some of the sound effects that go with it. And at the time, I decided I'd go ahead and just punt there because I didn't have a clear transition. I couldn't figure out a way to clearly transition from that loop into the other loop without it sounding weird. So I just... Yeah, well, I'm looking at the page, and I'm looking at how many buttons I have. And I'm saying, I got to get... Oh, I only get 15 buttons. So, yeah, you got to think about what happens when I push each button. And you probably should figure that out before you start bouncing things out and plugging it into the sampler, because that's going to affect the way you export stuff. So ultimately, when I go into here, so I hit that, and I get the sort of mud going, I get the hippos, they kind of loop. Right, so they're doing their thing. Then, what's the max button? 8? Let's just do 7. Ah, no, I did, so 6 I did. Let's get it. So 7 is my alligator. And here's another place I cheated. Okay? And this, I remember now why I did this. So you notice there I did actually jump my loop. Okay? So I've got music 4, which is here. No. What is it? Music 4. That one. Okay. somewhere I've got another little bit of music. Music 5. Where did that end up? Oh, I thought it was in a group. There it is. So that's all the way up here. All right. So, see here how that's the same loop at the beginning. So I was here. I'm in that loop. And then here, I go start that loop again, but then go into here. The idea there was because I had to jump a button there. So in order to make that transition work, I had a button at the end of a page that then led me into the page I was about to go to. So it was a little tricky there. And notice how this one now has it's in group 3, which has an even longer fade out on it. So when I go to the next transition into music 6, which is over here, which is when the crash comes in with the lion, because there was not a very clear way to transition that, and rhythmically I could never make it work. So I engineered that next loop to have a little fade out, so I could jump straight into this, and there was going to be a crash there, and then it'd be okay.
How did you balance levels?
Well, so this is the other reason why it's good to lay it out in Logic first. So I sort of did that all in Logic. So I mixed it just with the faders, so everything kind of made sense level-wise, and then bounced things out at those levels. And then that way I wouldn't have to do a ton of level tweaks. In fact, I ended up not having to do any, looks like. But you would do that here in the mixer, so your volume, you could go and adjust things. So if you needed to, you could, and that's the other reason why you keep things separate. As separate as possible, so that you can tweak levels if you need to. Okay, so that's basically that's the gist of it. Okay, is you bounce the stuff out in a way that allows you to trigger it independently. Then you set up loop points for the stuff that needs to loop, and not loop points for the stuff that doesn't need to loop. And you do that in Triumph, just like we learned to do before.
But you can't. So you're not. The loop is coming from Triumph. It's not coming from the sampler. It's not. You're not telling the sampler isn't telling it to keep playing something. It's just the sampler just tells it to play files, not loop files, not play once.
No, the sampler tells it to loop, but it just uses the loop markers that you put in Triumph. Because you have to drop the markers. You have to say, where does the loop begin and where does it end?
Right.
And trying to do that here with random numbers is going to be impossible.
That's why you do it in Triumph.
Which is why you do it in Triumph, so you can drop it's just a graphical way to look at it. Okay. But ultimately, if you turn on the loop here, it's going to follow those loop points. I mean, these numbers, it imported from the markers.
All right, so what's the next thing after this? Like, how did you get, what's the coding, I guess, that your buttons triggered those many cues?
That's the MIDI control. So all that stuff we did last week where we were putting in, those hexadecimal note messages into the buttons, you sit there and you think, okay, button 1, what are all the things I need to start? So in my case, for button 1, I need to start the, need to do that one, which is the opening music, right?
So for all the loops, are you programming note offs too?
Yeah.
Because otherwise they would just keep playing.
Right, exactly. So for button 1, I need this one, I need that one as well, right? So I need to start both of those at the same time with button 1. So I'm going to have 2 note on messages for that. And then button 2 would be my horn, I only need 1 for that. Button 3 would be my zebra and my wildebeest. Where it gets tricky, though, is button 4 has to do a few things. It has to stop the music there and start a bunch of new stuff. So if we look at, well, actually, I can show you in the PC1600.
The content is addressed by the key that you assigned it to?
Yeah. So you note on for whatever note number has the sound on it that you want. Okay, so let me open up my my file here. So here we go. On button 5, well, no, button 4, which is my rhino, I am starting 3 things, and then I'm doing a note off for middle C, which is my first music. So I'm starting both, let's see if I go to... Okay, so I'm starting the, yes, I know, stop. So I'm starting the crash, the music, and the peel out of the tires. So those are 3 separate samples that I'm starting with 3 separate note on messages. And then I'm doing a note off that stops the first music loop.
So it's 4 messages in one.
On one button. Exactly. And then button 5 is my screech. So I have to stop the music, and I have to stop the Jeep loop, and I have to start the screech. I have to start, let's see, this is button 5. Yeah, so I have to start the screech, I have to start the music, and I have to start the grunt. But I had to stop everything else that was going at the time. Okay?
Okay, and you bounce everything back to its button. Like in Logic, you bounce everything at the starting point where that button is being pressed.
Right.
To time everything out.
Yep.
Within the button.
Yep. So if I need something to happen in a sequence, I would bounce it with a gap so that I could start it at the same time as I started the other things I knew I was going to have to start with that button. So that there was a little bit of silence at the beginning of it. So when I start it, it waits a second, and then I hear it. Okay? And then you keep going. You repeat until you get all the way done. Okay, so that's how you do this. The other thing you're going to want, I'll tell you this right now, this should be the first button you program, is your all stop button. Okay? And I'll show you how I did mine. Well, it'll work over here too. Ultimately, well, this one is a little bit different. This is all notes off, but for each MIDI channel. In reality, you only really need it for the first MIDI channel because you're doing it all on one channel here. Okay, so if you look at how I did it here in, yeah, everything's on channel 1. So you've got one sampler here. It's loaded in Logic on one channel. So instead of, sometimes if you've got a hardware sampler, what you could do is load everything on the same note, but just a different MIDI channel, and then your hex is the same thing over and over again. You're just changing the channel number to get the thing you want, as opposed to changing the note number. But in this case, this is a limitation of the Logic EXS. You're going to need to do it at each thing on a different note. Okay, so you're not going to have to change channel number. So
channel 1 is the fact that they're all on the same line. If we go up 1, it's channel 2. Is that what you're saying?
Well, you could program Logic to do it that way. It doesn't do that by default. By default, Logic just kind of does everything on one channel. Okay, so here's my stop button, and I'm just literally doing an all notes off message. Okay, but here's the catch. Logic does not automatically respond to an all notes off message, as ridiculous as that sounds. Don't ask me why. So I went ahead and made it anyway, and then I did a keyboard command to respond to it. So if you go to Key Commands and edit that, let's see. So if you search for panic in your key commands, there's this send discrete note offs, panic. And I just did a learn new assignment. I learned it, and then I hit my button, which was my all notes off button. And so now I've said, anytime you get an all notes off message, issue this logic command. And what this logic command does is sends a discrete note off message for every single note in the thing. It takes a minute for it to happen.
Why is it discrete?
So watch. When I hit the button, watch what happens over here in logic. Look at it cycling through all those notes. So it's saying note off, note off, note off, note off, note off, note off. Kill everything.
so if someone goes through and just decides to play all the odd numbers,
yeah.
You have a program and off. So let's say 1 has a loop. All right, button 1 has a loop, and button 2 has to stop that loop. But if you skip 2 and you go to 3, that loop's it's never gonna get that message to stop, and button 1 loop is gonna keep.
Yeah, I mean, if I just go in and just go boom, 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 I get a mess. Right? I mean,
for all the
no,
loops of all buttons.
right? Because if you do that, then that's gonna hurt other things. So you can't control the kid who's gonna like hit all the buttons, right? That kid actually wants to hear the whole book all at one time. So go ahead and let him hear the whole book at one time. Okay.
That's quite normal.
Yeah. So that's fine. You can do that. But you do need to get a way to like stop this thing. Like for that kid who comes and hits everything, and now everything's looping all at the same time. You do need a way to ultimately like stop this thing. And so you would have one button that would do that. And that'll help you too, because every once in a while you're going to screw up your programming and forget to do a note off message or something, and you can't figure out how to get something to stop, and you need to have your panic button ready to go. All right, so that should be the first thing you program when you before you start programming the samplers. Program that panic button.
So is it? Should we get that software from you then?
This?
Yeah.
Well, you can download it from my website, right? So I showed you that, and then I believe I put a code already on Walrus.
On Walrus?
I think, and I can just email it to you actually, guys, actually right now if you want. About that. So actually, I just sent.
Sound and Music, or is it like...
No, the cd-romney.com.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so here, let me get you the code. Where are you? Have a special one for School of the Arts people. Let's see here. There it is. Okay, so there you go. You can use that. And that should unlock it for you. All right, so what you need to do now, I actually have to go. I have to get to a meeting that came up. But what you need to do now is start designing this thing, just in Logic. Don't worry about the sampler yet. Don't worry about the MIDI. Just lay it out. Okay, look at the book, come up with the music, come up with sound effects, lay it out as though you didn't have to do the sampler. But keep in the back of your mind that how things might need to loop and stuff like that. So whatever music you do. I mean, I did this all with GarageBand loops. And that's acceptable if that's what you want to do. So I'm not, the part of the artistry part of this is not the highest weighted criteria, right, of this exercise. I mean, I want you to do it well, and that is part of the criteria. I mean, if it sucks, I'll tell you, and that'll be part of what I grade you on. But it's a small part. Okay, the larger part is, were you able to wrap your head around this notion of nonlinearity? That's the big point. Okay.
I've already got mine completed in Logic just like that.
Great.
I didn't know what I was doing, so I just laid it out a long line, including reading the book. So the kid's going to read the book. Why can't you just bounce every page? So on page 1, he hits it as he reads. Page 2, he hits it as he reads.
You could. I think that you'd have to think through the transitions of that. Because ultimately you want this to seem seamless.
What are the transitions? Is it him turning the page?
Well, I mean, no, that, like, what do they hear? Like, ultimately you would like this to not sound like, oh, now we've just started a whole new thing when I flip this page. that should be that the transition between that when they hit the button, the transition between what they used to hear and what they hear now should sound seamless. And that's hard to do if you've just bounced out one page at a time, right? It's much easier to do if you've got separate cues in here, separate files, because then you can massage fade-ins and fade-outs on things. You know, have the music fade in a different way from the sound effects, and that you can make those transitions much smoother. I'm not saying this is easy.
You're done.